The heat hit Sergeant Daigo Kiryu like a fist the moment he stepped off the transport. It was the kind of summer that the old Earth scientists had stopped bothering to name, because the names kept getting retired and replaced. The kind of summer that made the asphalt shimmer like a living thing and turned the horizon into a slow, trembling lie. The kind of summer that made ordinary people stay inside and made soldiers wish they could. Daigo didn't stay inside. He never had. He stood at the edge of the staging yard at Forward Operating Base Amber, squinting into the white sky, and he let the heat press against him like a hand trying to push him back. He didn't move. He breathed through it the way his father had taught him. Slow, nose down, let the air settle in the chest before letting it go. Around him, the base hummed and rattled with the machinery of survival. Generators, coolant fans, the distant thrum of a patrol shuttle cycling engines, the smell of hot concrete and something older underneath it, something that didn't belong to any factory or fuel depot, something wild and vast and patient, the smell of whatever it was the Vorkai had left behind when they'd come through 3 months ago and turned half the eastern district into a crater. Nobody called them Vorkai anymore. The official designation was something in the coalition's military taxonomy. A string of letters and numbers that referred to the species, physiological class, their threat matrix, their engagement protocols. The soldiers called them by a dozen names, and most of those names weren't polite. Daigo called them what he'd called them since the first night he'd seen one, when he was 19 years old, and his unit had come over a ridge in the Kalthos Valley to find 30 of them standing perfectly still in the moonlight watching the burning town below with what he could only describe even now as hunger. He called them the Hollow, because that was what they made you feel when their eyes, those pale multifaceted eyes like cracked amber held up to a lamp, fixed on you across the distance. Not fear, exactly, not dread. Something emptier than either, a feeling like being looked at by something that had decided, a long time ago, that the universe did not require your input. He pulled the amber pendant from under his collar and held it in his palm for a moment. Dinosaur tooth, his father had told him. Real one, very old. He didn't know if that was true, but he'd worn it since he was 12, and he wasn't about to stop now. "You're going to roast standing there," said a voice behind him. Daigo turned. Uchi was crossing the yard toward him. Warrant Officer Utsusememaru, technically, but nobody on the team used ranks unless the colonel was watching. Uchi was tall and lean and moved with a kind of careful deliberateness that came from 400 years of martial conditioning, which was not a metaphor. The Vorkai's time distortion weapons had produced a handful of human combatants who had experienced subjective centuries of isolated combat. Uchi was the only one Daigo had ever met who'd come out of it still largely himself, which said something about Uchi that Daigo had never quite found words for. He was carrying his uniform jacket folded over one arm. His undershirt was soaked through with sweat, and he looked, for perhaps the first time since Daigo had known him, genuinely uncomfortable. "Thought you were at the beach," Daigo said. "I was," Uchi said. He reached Daigo and stopped beside him, also staring out at the shimmer on the horizon. "I returned early." "Why?" Uchi was quiet for a moment. "The women," he said with great gravity, "were in the water." Daigo blinked. "That's usually what happens at a beach." They were wearing very small garments, also typical. "I am from the 16th century, Uchi said, with a dignity that Daigo found genuinely impressive. "These things require adjustment." Daigo looked at him, this man who had survived 4 centuries of temporal imprisonment, who had fought the Hollow with nothing but a blade and the kind of patience that outlasted empires, who had once stood down a Vorkai siege commander in single combat and made it look like a formality, standing in the summer heat looking personally betrayed by the concept of swimwear. Daigo started to laugh. He couldn't help it. It came up from his chest like something that had been waiting, and once it started, it didn't stop for a while. Uchi watched him with perfect composure, which only made it worse. "I am glad," Uchi said, "that my discomfort is amusing to you." "It is," Daigo managed. "It really, really is." He wiped his eyes with the back of his wrist and looked at the base around them, the tired fortifications, the patched walls, the hand-lettered signs over the equipment bays that someone had put up as a joke and nobody had taken down. He felt the laugh drain out of him slowly, replaced by something quieter. Something that lived in the chest and wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite resolve but was made of both. "Come on," he said. "I've got something set up." He'd spent 3 hours that morning on it. Found a section of the unused medical bay that had been commandeered as storage and was therefore blessedly climate-controlled, and systematically cleared enough space for 2 folding chairs, a cooler he'd borrowed without asking from the mess, a string of solar lights that someone had left in the common room since last midsummer, and a hand-painted paper sign that said Uchi's beach in characters Daigo had copied from an old language primer because he wasn't going to let small detail like not reading traditional script stop him. Uchi stood in the doorway and stared at it. The string lights were yellow and blue. The cooler had cold water and, after some creative acquisition, cold barley tea and 2 slightly squashed portions of mango sticky rice that had traveled from the canteen in Daigo's jacket pockets and were none the worse for the journey. There was a small speaker playing something low and oceanic. Daigo had typed beach sounds into the audio archive and taken the first result, which was actually a documentary about tidal ecology but had good waves in it. This, Uchi said carefully, is not a beach. No, Daigo agreed. But it's got cool air and cold drinks and nobody trying to court-martial us for not being at the briefing. He dropped into one of the folding chairs. Sit down, Uchi. Uchi sat. He looked at the solar lights for a long moment. He looked at the paper sign. He looked at the mango sticky rice. He picked up one of the portions and held it in both hands the way he sometimes held things he hadn't decided how to feel about yet. You did this, he said, for me. Don't make it weird, Daigo said. I am not making it. Uchi stopped. He looked at the title documentary playing on the speaker. He looked at the yellow and blue lights. Something shifted in his face, something small and involuntary, and then his expression returned to its usual careful composure. But the shift had been there and Daigo had seen it. Thank you, Uchi said quietly. Drink your tea, Daigo said. They sat like that for a while, the cooled air humming around them, the synthetic waves rolling through the tiny speaker, the bass noise filtering through the walls at a manageable remove. And for a little while the war was somewhere else, and they were just 2 men, sitting in a room full of solar lights, eating sticky rice they didn't deserve, and listening to a documentary about tides. It was Daigo's field communicator that broke it. It always was. The tone was not the routine status tone. It was the other one. Daigo had the communicator in his hand before the second pulse finished. Kiryu, he said. Sergeant. The voice on the other end was Corporal Nagai from the intelligence section, and her voice had the particular texture of someone who was trying to sound calm and wasn't quite getting there. We've got a situation at Grid 7. Kyoryu Blue's gone dark. Daigo was already standing. How long? 40 minutes. He was on a solo sweep of the festival district. Last check-in was normal, then nothing. Festival district, Daigo repeated. He looked at Uchi. Uchi had set down his barley tea and was watching Daigo with the focused stillness of someone transitioning from rest to readiness. The Oban celebration, Nagai said. The city authority cleared it 2 weeks ago. The sector was clean. But there's been anomalous energy readings in that grid for the past 6 hours. The type the instruments call Category 7. Category 7 on the Coalition's energy taxonomy meant Vorkai temporal resonance. Specifically, it meant the kind of resonance that was associated with hollow entities that had been destroyed, neutralized, dispersed, sent back to whatever the hollow called their staging dimension, but had not entirely gone. Residual pattern intelligences, the science units called them. Operational command called them ghosts, because the name was accurate, and humans had always named true things with short words. I'm rolling, Daigo said. He was clipping his gear belt before he finished saying it. Uchi was already at the door. The festival district of the city had been named after a holiday that predated the war, one of those ancient calendar observances whose roots tangled down into a time when the biggest threats had names like drought and flood and locust, when the dead were honored with paper lanterns and the living danced in circles, and the world was comprehensible enough to be celebrated. The district still had the bones of that older identity. Lantern posts, low market stalls, a central square with a bandstand that no one had played in for 2 years, colored strings of bunting that had faded from the sun and the rain but hadn't been taken down. The streets were largely empty. Most civilians in Grid 7 had been relocated when the forward line had shifted 6 weeks ago. There were a few holdouts, the kind of people who didn't leave their neighborhood because the neighborhood was the self, but they had learned to stay indoors when the energy instruments started reading high. Daigo and Uchi came through the district on foot because a vehicle would announce them, and the situation report said Nasen, Sergeant Nobuharu Udo, Kyoryu Blue, the team's engineer and the oldest of them at 32 and the owner of a personal style of humor that Daigo privately classified as Catastrophically bad but somehow endearing, had gone dark without a contact call, which meant he either couldn't call or had something preventing him from calling. Neither option was good, but the second was worse. Splitting here, Daigo said, at the intersection of the main festival street and the secondary market lane. You come around through the craft stalls. I'll go direct. Understood, Uchi said. He paused. Daigo, yeah. Uchi looked at the empty street, the faded bunting, the unmanned stalls, the lantern posts with their dark globes. His face had a particular expression that Daigo associated with him processing the present moment against the long counterweight of his history. This district, he said, the festival. In my time, there was a celebration near this date. We called it differently, but the intent was the same, to honor the dead, to welcome their return. You think that matters here? Uchi looked at him. I think the Hollow have always been drawn to places where humans have gathered to remember their losses. I think there is something in that concentration of grief and memory that they find useful. I have thought this for a long time. Daigo digested that. Then we moved fast. They split at the intersection. Daigo went direct. He found Nasan in the central square, standing beside the old bandstand with his back very straight and his arms loose at his sides. This would have been fine, except that Daigo knew immediately that it wasn't Nasan. It was Nasan's body. It was Nasan's gear and Nasan's face and Nasan's characteristically terrible posture when he wasn't thinking about it. But the way it stood was wrong. Too still, too centered, carrying its weight in the feet rather than the hips. The head at an angle that was slightly off from Nasan's habitual slightly forward lean. And the eyes, when the figure turned to look at Daigo, were wrong. Not hollow amber wrong, not visually altered in any way that would register on a scan, just wrong. The way a photograph of a face is wrong. All the pixels correct and the soul absent. Nasan, Daigo said. He kept his voice level. His hand was on his sidearm. The figure that wore Nasan's face looked at him with Nasan's eyes and said nothing. Then it smiled. Nasan smiled a lot, generally. He was the kind of man who smiled through his bad jokes and through his worry about his family and through the long patrols and through the grinding nights when the Hollow came in numbers. But this smile was not Nasan's smile. It was constructed from the right muscles in the right arrangement. But it was constructed, and Daigo's spine knew the difference before his brain finished processing it. Hello, small fighter, said the thing in Nasan's face, with Nasan's voice but a cadence that was nothing human. We have been looking for someone like you. Daigo had his sidearm out. Step back. Keep your hands visible. We wear this body only as a courtesy, the thing said, ignoring the weapon with the perfect calm of something that had decided the weapon was not relevant to its interests. We mean to deliver a message. A demonstration. Back up, Daigo said. Now. We are Debo Tangaseku, the thing said, and our companion. And then Nasan's body took a step forward and Daigo saw the second shimmer, a layered wrongness, like two slightly misaligned images, and understood that what was possessing Nasan was not one entity but two, occupying the same vessel in a configuration he'd never seen a Category 7 pattern intelligence manage before. Daigo didn't fire. You didn't fire into a possessed host. The Hollow knew this. The Hollow used this. He keyed his communicator with his offhand. Uchi, Central Square now. Blue is compromised. Double entity possession, Category 7. Coming, Uchi's voice said, already close. The thing wearing Nasan watched Daigo key the communicator with something that might have been amusement. It was hard to tell. The Hollow's emotional range was not a one-to-one map of anything human, and even when they wore human faces, the expressions they produced were translations rather than originals. Technically accurate, somehow fundamentally off. You carry the memory of the old world, the thing said. It turned its borrowed head slightly. This place, these decorations, the lanterns not yet lit. Your people gathered here once to speak to their dead. We still do, Daigo said. He was watching its hands and its weight distribution and the subtle wrongness of its balance cataloging information. Yes, it said. And that speech, that sustained pattern of grief and recollection and longing, it persists. It is a frequency. It is how we return. It tilted Nasan's head the other way, bird-like, a motion no human neck would naturally make at that angle. The Hollow are not gone when you destroy them. We are dispersed. And when the summer comes, and the old festival comes, and the humans remember their dead with exactly this quality of, it seemed to search for a word, tenderness. We find the frequency again. We come back through it. Long speech for a ghost, Daigo said. We wanted you to understand. Before the demonstration, Uchi came around the corner of the bandstand at precisely that moment, moving fast and low, and the thing wearing Nasan turned with inhuman speed. And Daigo moved left, and for approximately 90 seconds the central square of the festival district became a very complicated place. The Hollow, when they possessed a human body, didn't make the body stronger than it was. They didn't have to. What they did was remove the body's hesitation. Human beings fought with approximately 60% of their actual physical capacity at any given time, because the nervous system maintained a constant conservative reserve to prevent catastrophic self-injury, tearing a tendon, shattering a joint, burning out a muscle. The Hollow simply switched off the reserve. The result was something that hit harder than it should, moved faster than it should, and took punishment without flinching, because the host's pain response was rerouted through the possession matrix, and the entity doing the possessing did not find pain interesting. Daigo had fought possessed individuals before. The key was leverage, not force. You couldn't outforce something that had turned off its own damage-limiting systems. You worked angles. You worked the joints. You got the body into a position where the physics of it, not the will of the possessing entity, but the simple mechanical reality of the skeleton, prevented it from doing the thing it was trying to do. He got Nasan's body into a corner, the low wall of the bandstand stage, a trellis post at Nasan's left, Daigo himself at Nasan's front, and Uchi came in from the right with a controlled takedown that put them both on the ground, and then Uchi had one hand locked behind Nasan's shoulder and was holding with the patient absolute certainty of a man who'd had 400 years to learn how bodies worked. The thing wearing Nasan didn't stop. It thrashed with a mechanical relentlessness, no grunting, no gasping, no reaction to the strain it was putting through the borrowed joints. Just the steady, focused effort of a pattern intelligence that had decided this configuration was unacceptable. "You cannot hold us indefinitely," it said, through Nasan's teeth with Nasan's voice, and it was technically true. "Don't need to," Daigo said. He was reaching for his equipment satchel, the one with the battery cells. The Zyudenchi, the energy cores that the Coalition xenobiology team had developed from the Hollow's own temporal signature, turned back on them, worked differently on Pattern 7 entities than they did on physical Hollow units. On a standard Hollow combat form, a Zyudenchi discharge was a weapons effect. On a Category 7 ghost, a residual pattern intelligence, a spirit that had rematerialized through a grief frequency. It was something more like an exorcism. It disrupted the resonance pattern that kept the entity cohered, scattered it back into the dimensional static from which it had coalesced. The problem was that Daigo had two entities sharing one host, which complicated the discharge geometry. A single Zyudenchi optimized for one entity type might scatter one and leave the other fully in control. He needed two different frequencies, simultaneously applied, and he had the batteries but not the delivery mechanism. He'd grabbed his standard kit when the call came in and hadn't had time to rig the dual discharge configuration. He was going to have to improvise, as usual. "Hold him tight," Daigo said to Uchi. "I am aware," Uchi said through his teeth, because Nasan's body was using the free shoulder to do something inventive and not pleasant. Daigo had the Alamarus cell in his right hand and the Overapu cell in his left. Two different frequencies, two different energy signatures, named for the dinosaur spirit patterns encoded into them when the weapons program was first established. He needed both to connect simultaneously. He had exactly one way to do that without a proper discharge rig. He pressed both cells against the back of Nasan's neck at the same time, held them there with his full body weight, and said to Uchi, "Cover your eyes." Uchi, who had been through enough bizarre moments in 400 years of combat not to argue with instructions that came with that kind of specificity, covered his eyes. The discharge was visible. Not bright exactly, but perceptible, the way a cold day makes the air look different, without making it look darker or lighter. The energy rolled outward from the contact point in two distinct wave patterns that interpenetrated without interfering, and the thing wearing Nasan arched backward and produced a sound that was not any sound Nasan's voice was built to make. Something between a harmonic and a scream, and the noise an instrument makes when the wrong note is held against the resonant frequency of its body. Then Nasan went completely limp. Then, after a pause that felt much longer than it was, Nasan made a small, confused, entirely normal human noise, and said, "Why is my face on the ground?" Daigo sat back. His hands were shaking slightly. They always did, after the close ones. He folded them together and let them shake. "How do you feel?" he asked. Nasan rolled over with some assistance from Uchi, and sat up and looked at them both with the expression of a man assembling information from inadequate data. My shoulder, he said slowly, feels like I tried to lift a dropship. He paused. Why does my shoulder feel like I tried to lift a dropship? You were possessed by two hollow ghosts simultaneously, Daigo said, for approximately 40 minutes. Nasan looked around at the central square, the festival bunting, the bandstand, the lantern posts. He looked at his own hands. He looked at Daigo and Uchi. I don't remember any of it, he said. That's probably a mercy, Uchi said. Nasan sat with that for a moment, the way he sat with things when he was deciding how to hold them. He was a man who felt his way through the world carefully. Careful not because he was timid, but because he understood that the world contained other people and things broke when you stopped being careful about other people. Were they trying to hurt you? He said. When they had me, they were trying to demonstrate something, Daigo said. Did they? Daigo thought about what the entity had said. The grief frequency, the quality of tenderness, the old festival and the pattern intelligences finding their way back through it, through the accumulated resonance of humans who kept returning to the same places to speak to the same dead. Yeah, he said. They did. He offered Nasan a hand up. Nasan took it. They stood in the central square of the festival district, the three of them, in the midsummer heat that pressed down from a white sky, surrounded by the relics of a celebration that had survived everything because some things were older than any particular war, older than the Hollow, older than the Coalition, older than the forward operating bases and the energy weapons and the tactical taxonomies that turned ancient hungers into strings of letters and numbers. Can you walk? Daigo asked. I can always walk, Nasan said with a touch of affront that was entirely his own. They walked. The briefing that afternoon was in the operations center, which had the aggressive air conditioning of a room where important bad news was regularly delivered. Colonel Tanaka stood at the front with the holographic display cycling through the Grid 7 energy readouts, and the readouts told a story that Daigo had been piecing together all the way back from the festival district. The Category 7 spikes were not isolated to Grid 7. They were distributed across a 12-kilometer arc that corresponded, when overlaid on the historical municipal records that the intelligence section had dug up, almost exactly to the festival circuit, the route that the old city celebration had followed. In the years before the war, through the lantern lighting and the dancing and the ceremony of speaking the names of the dead aloud in public, the hollow ghosts were not random. They were using the infrastructure of the festival itself, the deeply grooved channels that human memory had cut through the landscape over generations of repetition as a kind of transmission line. Every place where people had stood and remembered and grieved, they had left a signal. The signal had persisted, and now the Hollow were coming through it. We have 17 confirmed Category 7 events in the past 6 hours, the colonel said, with the calm of someone who had delivered so much bad news that bad news had lost its texture. Most are transient. The pattern intelligences are materializing, looking for hosts, and dispersing when they can't find them, or when the local energy environment doesn't sustain them. Sergeant Udo's case was unusual. 2 entities co-locating in one host requires a significant shared coherence. It suggests the entities in question were linked before their dispersal. They had enough residual connection to find each other in the frequency and consolidate. Holiday-themed, said Daigo, who had read the intelligence file on the entity types. The previous engagement records call them Debo Tango Seku and Debo Tanabanta, holiday hollow units. They were destroyed, dispersed, during the summer offensive 8 months ago. That tracks, said Lieutenant Yayoi from the technical desk, without looking up from her instruments. She had the particular focus of someone who was working on 3 things simultaneously and managing all of them. Category 7 coherence time runs on a seasonal cycle. The dispersed patterns weaken over winter, when the memorial density in the environment is lower. They peak in summer, specifically during the Oban window, the annual period when human memorial activity historically concentrates. So every summer they come back, Nasan said, until they're dispersed with enough energy to permanently degrade the coherence pattern, Yayoi said. A standard discharge scatters them, a high-amplitude dual-frequency discharge, the kind that disrupts both elements of a linked pair simultaneously, can degrade the pattern below coherence threshold. They don't reform, they're done. That's what Daigo did in the square, Uchi said. What Daigo did in the square was extremely inadvisable field improvisation, Yayoi said, now looking up, with an expression that contained approximately equal parts academic disapproval and reluctant respect. The probability of cross-interference between the Alamarus and Ovirapu frequencies at that contact distance was, "Did it work?" Daigo said. "Yes," Yayoi said. "Then it was advisable," Daigo said. Yayoi looked at him for a moment. "You were extremely lucky." "I'm usually extremely lucky," Daigo said, not of a boast but as a statement of observed fact, which was somehow worse. The colonel let the exchange settle, and then brought the briefing back to the operational question, which was, how many linked pairs were still active in the festival circuit? How did you find them? And how did you put them down permanently? The answer to the first question was unknown. The answer to the second was complicated. The answer to the third was, you needed a specific energy configuration that the current field kit wasn't optimized to deliver. "We have the Igaranodon cell," Yayoi said, pulling up a schematic. "It's a third-generation Spirit Ranger frequency that was designed specifically for linked pair dispersion. The problem is it requires a 2-operator discharge sequence, 1 operator to hold the target stable, 1 to deliver the final pulse. The timing window is approximately 1.4 seconds. I can hold a target stable for 1.4 seconds, Uchi said. You would need to hold a possessed host stable, while simultaneously maintaining enough physical control to prevent the possessing entity from disrupting the discharge sequence," Yayoi said. "The entity will feel the initial pulse coming. It will fight. The disruption rate on previous attempts has been..." "Yayoi," Uchi said gently, "I have been fighting the Hollow since before your great-grandparents were born. I can hold a target." There was a pause. 97% baseline capacity for the remaining daylight window, she said. "After dark, the festival frequency spikes and the coherence rates go up. You want to do this before sundown." Daigo looked at the chrono. 3 hours. "Then we'd better move," he said. What followed was the kind of afternoon that Daigo would later recall not in sequence but in fragments. The way memory preserved what mattered and dropped the connective tissue. The heat pressing down through the festival streets. The empty stalls with their faded colors. The specific quality of late summer light that turned the world amber and shadow. Old and tired and beautiful in the way that things were beautiful when you understood they were temporary. They worked the circuit in pairs. Daigo and Uchi on the main festival route, Na-san on the secondary lanes with the technical team providing remote monitoring. The Category 7 spikes showed up on the instruments as smears of warm static on the display, like thumbprints on a glass. Where the smear concentrated, you stopped and you listened, and after a while, Daigo developed a method for hearing it that he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't been trained on hollow resonance. A quality of stillness in the air that was slightly wrong, the way the heat haze moved a few degrees off-center, the feeling at the back of the throat that was not quite a taste and not quite a pressure. 3 times they found living hosts, local holdouts who'd stayed when the district was evacuated, drawn out by the summer heat and the habit of their own lives to walk the same routes they'd always walked. All 3 were early-stage possessions. The entities barely cohered, and Daigo was able to disperse them with standard single-frequency discharges before the possession deepened. The hosts came back to themselves confused and shaky and grateful in the vague, uncomprehending way of people who had nearly lost something without knowing it. The 4th one was harder. He was an old man, 70-something, with the patient face of someone who had decided some time ago that the world's events were not going to change his fundamental schedule. He was sitting on a stool in front of a stall that had clearly been his stall, a lantern maker's shop by the remnant stock still hanging from the rafters, and he was watching the empty street with an expression so still and so internally remote that for a moment Daigo thought he was meditating. Then the man turned his head, and Daigo saw the eyes and stepped back and got his hand on his weapon. The entity in the old man's body was more deeply cohered than the previous ones. It had been there longer, feeding on the concentrated grief frequency of a man who had spent 20 years running a lantern shop at the exact center of the festival circuit, who had, the intelligence section would tell them later, lost his wife in the first hollow incursion and his son in the second, and kept coming back to the stall because where else was he going to go? He was an archive of the frequency. He was a lighthouse for it. The entity had settled into him like water into an old stone, finding every crack. "This one's different," Uchi said quietly at Daigo's shoulder. "Yeah, the dispersion will take both of us, the full Igaranodon sequence. I know, he'll fight. The entity will fight hard. He's a deep host." Daigo looked at the old man, at the borrowed face, the wrong eyes, the remnant of a person visible somewhere underneath like a light behind frosted glass. He thought about the entity's words in the central square, the grief frequency, the sustained pattern of tenderness. This man had been tending a lantern shop for 20 years in a war zone, because the lantern shop was where his wife had worked and his son had played. And the memory of them lived in the colored papers and the wire frames and the smell of the lacquer. The entity had found the richest vein of it in the district and settled in. The pendant was warm against his sternum in the heat. "Get him steady," Daigo said. What Uchi did then was something Daigo had never seen him do before and hadn't known was in his repertoire. And later, trying to describe it, he gave up after a few attempts because the words available to him were all wrong for it. Uchi walked up to the old man, to the thing wearing the old man, and he sat down on his heels to put himself at the man's eye level, and he said something, not loudly, not as a command or a challenge or a tactical instruction. He said it the way you said something to a person you were trying to reach through a layer of distance and grief and years. He said, "We know you are in there. We are going to bring you back." The entity in the old man's face narrowed the borrowed eyes and tilted the borrowed head with that bird-like alien wrongness and said, "There is no back to bring. This vessel has been empty a long time." "No," Uchi said. "It has been full of loss. That is not the same as empty." And then he had the old man's wrists gently, firmly. The grip of someone who had trained for 400 years and understood the control did not require cruelty. And he was steady, perfectly steady. And Daigo stepped in from the side and placed the Igaranodon cell and held the discharge configuration and counted down in his head. The entity fought. It fought with the old man's strength, which was not inconsiderable, and with the mechanical relentlessness of something that had no pain register and no fatigue and no particular investment in the continued structural integrity of its host. It drove the borrowed shoulder against Uchi's grip and tried to turn and tried to break the angle, and the whole time Uchi held, just held. 1.4 seconds. Daigo had counted them on ranges, had trained on them in the simulator, had been told by 3 separate weapons technicians that they were technically achievable under controlled conditions. Uchi held for 2. The Igaranodon discharge went through clean. The old man sagged. Uchi caught him, and then he was back all at once. The way you came back from deep cold water when you finally broke the surface, gasping, blinking, profoundly confused about how he'd gotten here from whatever he last remembered. "Easy," Uchi said, holding him up. "Easy, you are all right." The old man looked at Uchi's face, then at the empty street, then at the faded bunting and the lantern posts and the remnants of his own stall. "It's festival time," he said, still confused, reaching for familiar coordinates. "My wife, she used to open the stall early." "I know," Uchi said. He was still holding the old man steady. "I know she did." Daigo watched them and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. They walked the rest of the circuit as the light changed. The sun got low and amber, and the shadow stretched long, and the festival district took on the quality of something dreamed. The colors too saturated, the silence too complete, the occasional stirring of a paper lantern in the warm evening air carrying a weight that no ambient wind could explain. Nasen caught up with them near the eastern end of the main street, limping slightly on the shoulder. The entities had used hard during the possession, and reported that the secondary lanes were clear. 5 more transient Category 7s, all dispersed, no further hosts found. "That should be it," Daigo said. "Yayoi is running confirmation scans," Nasen said. He paused. "The old man all right?" "He will be," Uchi said. Nasen nodded. He had a look on his face that was his serious look. The one underneath the bad jokes and the deliberate cheerfulness. The one that came out when he was processing something real. "Those things," he said. "In me, I don't remember them. But I remember, before, walking through the district. It was the smell that got me." He stopped. "The smell of the festival. Old lacquer and paper, and the particular kind of incense they burn here. My sister's family used to come here for the festival. Before." He stopped again. "I got distracted, stood still too long, and then they used the grief," Daigo said, "the memory of loss, as a signal, as a path." Nasen said. He was quiet for a moment. "Kind of makes sense, actually. They've always used what we give them, the hollow. They've always known that what breaks us is what holds us too. The things we care about most are the things we grieve the hardest. They use that, but they don't understand it," Uchi said. They both looked at him. Uchi was looking at the festival street, the lantern posts and the old stalls and the faded colors. "I spent 400 years in something very like what those entities experienced," he said. "Dispersed, pattern without substance, present without being present. I know what it is to exist as residue." He paused. They use the grief frequency because it is the strongest signal they can find. But they do not understand what makes it strong. They do not understand that the strength of it comes from the fact that the people who grieve are still here. That the frequency is strong because the connection was real. They think they are exploiting a weakness. He paused again. They are drinking from a well they could not build. Daigo looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at the pendant in his hand. He'd taken it out again without noticing the habit of it. Dinosaur tooth, old bone. His father's voice saying, "Carry it. It'll remind you what you're made of." "We should light the lanterns," he said. Nasen looked at him. "The district is still technically a restricted zone. There's nobody here to restrict us." The colonel is at the briefing wrap-up," Daigo said, "and I found a whole crate of paper lanterns in the eastern supply stall that nobody's filed acquisition paperwork on." Nasen looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man doing a rapid moral inventory and finding that his objections were insufficient to the emotional weight of the moment. "There might also," Daigo added, "be string lights." They lit the lanterns. All of them. The ones in the eastern stall. The ones in the 2 western stalls that still had functioning lamp elements. The ones in the lantern maker's shop that the old man had shown them when Uchi helped him back inside and he'd found his hands moving through the familiar inventory with the muscle memory of 30 years. He'd lit them himself, the old man, with a small lighter he kept in his apron pocket, moving from lantern to lantern with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the entities and everything to do with the long practice of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The festival district filled slowly with light. Not the hard artificial light of the base, not the clinical brightness of the operations center, but something warmer and less steady. Paper and flame, color filtered through tissue, the specific quality of illumination that existed precisely because it was impermanent. They stood in it, Daigo, Uchi, Nasen, at the edge of the central square with the lantern maker's shop glowing behind them, and the main street stretched out ahead of them, and for a little while nobody said anything. Then Nasen, who had been quiet for longer than was normal for him, said, "My wife and I used to bring my niece here for the festival. Before the war. She was 3 the last time. She carried a lantern the whole length of the main street without dropping it." He paused. "She was very proud of herself." "She should have been," Daigo said. "Yeah," Nasen said. He was looking at the lanterns. "Yeah, she should have been." Uchi said nothing, because Uchi understood that silence was sometimes the most precise language available. Daigo looked at the lights. All those paper flames, each one a small stubborn argument against the dark. He'd lit them because they needed lighting, because the district needed them, because the people who'd used to walk this route, with their own grief and their own tenderness, deserved better than a restricted zone and an energy, reading on a military instrument. But standing here in the warm evening with the amber light moving across the faces of 2 people he would have followed into any fire. He thought he understood now what the entities had been trying to use and why they'd fail at it every time. You could use grief as a signal. You could find the frequency and write it back. But the frequency was strong because the love was real. And the love was real because the people were still here. And as long as they were still here, the signal would always belong to them more than it would ever belong to the thing trying to exploit it. The Hollow were very old and very patient and very good at understanding the mechanics of human vulnerability. They had never once understood that the vulnerability and the strength were the same thing. A communication tone. Daigo's field unit, the standard one this time, not the emergency tone. He checked the display, Yayoi, grid 7 clear. All category 7 signatures below coherence threshold. Permanent dispersion confirmed on the paired entities. Good work. Then, after a pause, Yayoi, also you are technically in a restricted zone. I'm not seeing you on any active sensor feeds, however, which is extremely convenient. Daigo smiled. He put the communicator away. Clear, he told the others. Nasen let out a breath. He rolled his shoulder experimentally, winced, and then seemed to decide it wasn't worth reporting. Uchi was still looking at the lights. He had an expression that was very quiet and very far away and not entirely sad. The expression he sometimes had when the present moment and the long depth of his history were briefly aligned, when 400 years of accumulated experience settled into the exact right position to understand a specific small thing. This is what they cannot do, he said. The Hollow. They can find the frequency. They can write it. They can wear the face of someone who grieves. He paused. But they cannot stand in the light and remember. They cannot miss something that is gone and still. still wanted to have existed. They cannot love the dead the way the living do, which is to say, without hope of return, without strategic purpose, simply because the dead were real and the life they had was real, and that reality does not disappear when they do. Daigo looked at him, Uchi, who had been dead to his own era for 400 years, who had loved a lord and a country and a world that no longer existed in any form he would have recognized, who had come back to the present and learned to stand in it without flinching. "You know something about that," Daigo said. "I know something about that," Uchi agreed. They stood a little longer. The lanterns moved in the warm evening air. The old man in the shop was doing something, straightening the display, maybe, or simply inhabiting the space that had belonged to him and his people for a long time, and would go on belonging to them, because belonging was not a thing the Hollow could revoke. Eventually, Nasen said, "I'm starving. Does anyone have any sticky rice?" Daigo laughed. "I have mango sticky rice," he said, "but it's in the climate-controlled medical bay that I definitely didn't turn into a beach." "There is also cold barley tea," Uchi said with great dignity. Nasen looked between them. "You two made a beach, an indoor beach," Daigo said, "with string lights, and a documentary about tides." "I don't know what to do with either of you," Nasen said. They walked back through the festival district as the sky went from amber to violet to the deep blue that preceded full dark. Behind them, the lanterns glowed in the empty streets. Dozens of small arguments against the dark, swaying in the warm air, filling the old circuit with a light that had nothing to do with military operations or energy taxonomies or the mechanics of alien possession. Just light. Just people remembering that light was something you could make. What happened next came out of the dark at the edge of the festival circuit, at the junction between the Lantern District and the industrial sector to the east, in the form of a signal that the instruments registered as a Category 9. Daigo had never seen a Category 9 before. Neither had Nasan. Neither had Uchi. The category existed in the taxonomy as a theoretical designation, a classification that the xenobiology team had built into the scale as a mathematical extension, the way you built the top floor of a scale before anything had ever reached it. Just so the architecture was ready. Category 9 was a fully cohered pattern intelligence, not a ghost, not a residual dispersed entity. A hollow being that had achieved sufficient temporal resonance to reconstruct itself completely, not possessing a host body but building its own coherent form out of the grief frequency of the district, shaped by the accumulated pattern of what humans had brought here over generations, and what the hollow had been absorbing of that pattern for months. It was large, not in the way a physical hollow unit was large, not the biomechanical scale that made you aware of your own fragility. Larger than that, in the specific way that things were large when their scale was not primarily physical. It stood at the junction, and the air around it was the wrong temperature and the wrong color, a kind of cold amber shimmer that had no business being on a summer evening. And when it turned toward them, Daigo felt the thing that he'd felt once before in his life. In the Kalthos Valley, 19 years old, standing on a ridge above a burning town, the feeling of being looked at by something that had decided the universe did not require his input. He stood his ground. This was not bravery. This was, he would have told you if you'd asked him, calmly and without drama, simply the only option. You stood your ground or you didn't, and if you didn't, then the thing behind you was going to reach the lanterns and the old man in his shop and the festival circuit and the people who still existed in the grief frequency of this place. So you stood. The amber pendant was warm in his hand. He hadn't realized he'd taken it out again. "Uchi," he said. "I see it," Uchi said. "Nasen." "Here," Nasen said. He was limping. He'd had a bad day. He was here. The Category 9 moved toward them. What Daigo did, what he decided, in the specific way that decisions under pressure didn't feel like decisions but like recognizing what you already knew, was to use the festival circuit itself as the discharge mechanism. The Category 9 had cohered out of the grief frequency. It was built from it, constituted of it. Its structural coherence depended on the signal that the human memorial pattern had been broadcasting from this place for 20 years. If you reversed the frequency, if you took the same signal and phase-inverted it, which was a thing that was theoretically possible with a sufficiently powerful Zyudenchi configuration and a sufficiently strong anchor point, you didn't just scatter the entity, you used its own constitution against it. The grief frequency was its building material. You turned the building material into a solvent, the lanterns. He turned and looked at them, all the paper flames he and Nasen and Uchi had lit, standing in their slow sway along the festival circuit. every one of them a point of human intention in the dark, every one of them part of the oldest signal that had been running in this place. The signal the Hollow had been trying to exploit and had never understood. The lanterns aren't just light, Daigo said. Not to Uchi, not to Nasen, possibly to himself, possibly to the pendant worm in his hand. They're frequency anchors. Every place a person stands and remembers. It's a signal node. We've been broadcasting from every one of them since we lit them. You want to use the festival circuit as a discharge array, Nasen said, with the voice of a man recognizing an engineering concept in an unexpected context. The Igaranodon cell through the main circuit anchor, the bandstand square, Daigo said, with enough power to phase invert the whole grid. That's... Nasen started. He stopped. He looked at the Category 9, which was now close enough that they could feel the wrong temperature of the air around it. He looked at the lanterns. He looked at the circuit that ran from the bandstand through the main street through the lantern district, and back again. That's extremely inadvisable field improvisation, he said, in the exact same category as pressing two conflicting Zyudenchi against a man's neck simultaneously. Did that work? Daigo said. Yes, Nasen said. Then it's advisable, Daigo said. Two things happened then in rapid succession that changed the geometry of what was possible. The first was that Tesai and Ramirez appeared. They came out of the festival circuit's eastern approach, Spirit Rangers, which was the Coalition's designation for human combatants, whose life energy had become sufficiently intertwined with the Zyudenchi frequency that they maintained a form of operational existence even after their physical death. They were not ghosts in the way the Hollow entities were ghosts. They were something else, something for which the taxonomy had no good word, because it was fundamentally a human thing, and the taxonomy had been built to describe the Hollow. Tesai was a large man who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had been in combat for a very long time, and had learned that precision was more valuable than speed. Ramirez had the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had gotten to the other side of their own mortality and found it clarifying rather than frightening. They took in the Category 9 in the lanterns, and the three of them standing in the festival street with the expression of people who had arrived exactly at the right moment and were not surprised by it. The spirits are drawn here, Tesai said without preamble. This is the season, this is the place. The spirits of the Zyuden Ryu are here also, the dinosaur spirits, the deep frequency, not just the hollow echoes, the real ones. We know what you're trying to do, Ramirez said to Daigo. He had a slight accent that placed him somewhere in the history of the Western world and not in any particular decade. The phase inversion, the circuit anchor. Can it work? Daigo asked. It can work, Tesai said, but the Igaranodon cell alone doesn't have the amplitude. Not for a Category 9. What does? The dinosaur spirits can amplify it, Ramirez said. They've been building resonance in the circuit since the lanterns were lit. You gave them a structure to work with. Daigo looked at the lanterns, all those small flames he'd lit, because they needed lighting, because the street needed them, because some things were too important to leave unlit. A structure to work with. He hadn't been thinking in those terms. But the circuit was a structure, and the lanterns were nodes, and every place a person had stood to. Remember, something real had added its frequency to the signal, and the Zyudenryu spirits had apparently been paying attention to all of it. The pendant was almost hot now. The dinosaur tooth his father had given him. The old bone that was older than the war and older than the hollow and older than anything in the military taxonomy. The frequency encoded in it was, according to the xenobiology team, indistinguishable from the Zyudenchi resonance. Had been there since before the Zyudenchi were ever built. Uchi, Daigo said. I know, Uchi said. He was already moving to the bandstand. Nasen. The circuit runs through the main lantern anchor at the bandstand, Nasen said, already running the numbers in his head. Because this was the thing that Nasen was extraordinary at. The field engineering, the live calculation, the look of absolute focus that his face got when a problem was solvable, if you were willing to be creative with the definition of solving. The Igaranodon cell through the anchor point, amplified by the dinosaur spirit resonance, phase inverted against the Category 9's coherence signature. He paused. Tesai, the spirit amplification, you can route it through the circuit nodes? Every lantern is a node, Tesai said. You already built the array. You just need to trigger it. The second thing that happened was the Category 9 reached them. It didn't attack. The Hollow didn't attack the way humans attacked, with the intent to destroy. They moved to absorb, to possess, to overlay. The Category 9 was a fully cohered pattern intelligence, and what it wanted was the circuit, the grief frequency array, the signal infrastructure that the festival had built over decades, the network of human memory nodes that ran from the Lantern District to the bandstand square and back. It wanted to own it. Nasan put himself between the Category 9 and the bandstand, with the bad shoulder and the day he'd had, and the complete absence of hesitation. That was the thing about Nasan that none of the bad jokes ever quite obscured. He put himself between it and the bandstand, and he looked at Daigo and he said, "Go." Daigo ran. Uchi was at the bandstand anchor point, the central column of the old structure, the place where the circuit converged, where the frequency was most concentrated. He had his hands on the column and his eyes closed, and he was... Daigo couldn't have described it, later, with any technical precision. Not fighting, not resisting, something else. Something that looked from the outside like a man being very quiet on purpose. Listening. He was listening. The Zyudenryu spirits were in the circuit. Daigo could feel them now, not see them, not hear them in any frequency audible to human ears, but feel them, the way you felt a current in water without seeing the current itself. The deep old resonance of things that had been part of this world since before the word world existed in any human language. The dinosaurs, in whatever form consciousness, persisted past extinction, paying attention to a festival district full of paper lanterns and the stubborn refusal of several soldiers to let the dark win. Daigo reached the column. He had the Igaranodon cell in one hand and the amber pendant in the other, and he held them both against the wood and closed his eyes and did the thing that he would never be able to explain to any military instrument or xenobiology team or tactical taxonomy. He remembered his father, not any specific memory. The whole frequency of the man. His voice in the early mornings, the way he'd moved through the world with that particular combination of gentleness and absolute refusal to quit. The expeditions they'd taken together before the war, when the world was still large enough to get lost in, and finding your way back was an adventure rather than an operational necessity. The pendant warm in his hand, the smell of old stone and cold air, and something wild and vast and patient. The circuit activated. It went through every lantern in the district, every small flame, every paper globe, every point of light that someone had carried down this route in every year of the festival's history, every node of human memory that the grief frequency had built into the landscape over decades of uninterrupted use. It went through all of them at once and came back amplified, the Zyudenryu resonance stacked on the human frequency, stacked on the Igaranodon discharge. A signal that was not a weapon exactly, but was more specifically lethal than any weapon because it was the grief frequency phase inverted, turned from a beacon into a solvent, using the Category 9's own constitution to unmake it. The Category 9 did not scream. The hollow didn't scream. They dispersed. The particular cold amber shimmer of it, the wrongness of the air temperature, the feeling of being observed by something ancient and indifferent, collapsed like a standing wave when the resonant frequency was removed, like a knot coming undone, like a long note that had finally reached its end. The festival district was quiet, and then the lanterns were just lanterns again, paper and flame and color in the warm summer air, swaying gently, saying nothing more complex than that someone had bothered to light them. Daigo opened his eyes. Uchi was looking at him from across the bandstand. Nasan was standing where he'd planted himself, and the Category 9 was gone, and he had the expression of a man checking himself for damage and finding, somewhat to his surprise, that he was fine. "My shoulder," Nasan said, after a moment, "still really hurts." "I know," Daigo said. "I'm going to need someone to carry things for the rest of the week." "I'll carry things," Daigo said. "I as well," Uchi said. Nasan looked at them both. He had a look on his face that he sometimes got, not often, and he usually covered it fast with a bad joke. But Daigo had been watching for it long enough to catch it when it happened. A look that was entirely undefended, entirely real. The face of a man who understood that he was held and found that understanding enormous. "Okay," Nasan said in a slightly different voice than usual. "Okay, good." The lanterns went on swaying. The old man in the lantern maker's shop had come to his doorway to look, drawn by the light or the quiet or some instinct about events in his district that 20 years of running a festival stall had built into him, and he stood in the doorway with his hands in his apron pockets, watching the lights along the main street with the expression of someone who had expected to see something and found something better. Tessai and Ramirez were no longer there. Spirit Rangers didn't linger, which was something Daigo had learned and then learned again and never quite gotten used to. but the frequency they'd routed through the circuit was still present, in a different form now. Quieter. Not the combat amplitude of the discharge, but something older and more settled, the deep resonance of things that had been part of the world before the war, and would be part of it after. Yayoi's voice came through the communicator. Grid 7, all readings nominal, Category 9 signature fully dispersed. No residual coherence patterns detected anywhere in the festival circuit. A pause. That was, I don't actually have a technical term for what you did. The phase inversion through a human-built memorial frequency array, amplified by prehistoric resonance patterns. Another pause. I'm going to need at least 3 days to write the report. Take 4, Daigo said. Take 4 and take the festival weekend off. The festival weekend, she said slowly. There isn't technically a festival. The district is. Look out your window, Daigo said. He heard her move. He heard the pause that followed. Oh, she said. Yeah, Daigo said. He put the communicator away. The pendant went back under his collar, warm against the sternum, old bone against living skin. Around him the festival circuit glowed with all its paper flames, and the summer heat was still there. It was always there, this kind of summer. It pressed and pressed and pressed. But in the light the heat was something different, not an adversary, just the season being itself. Uchi came to stand beside him. Is it enough? Uchi said. Not a military question, not a tactical assessment, something older than both. Daigo looked at the lanterns. At Nasen checking his shoulder with the careful attention of a man who intended to be fully operational again as soon as physically possible. At the old lantern maker in his doorway, watching his circuit full of light with the expression of someone seeing something they'd stopped believing they'd see again. It's never enough, Daigo said. That's not the point. Uchi considered that. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. The point, Daigo said, is that you do it anyway. You light the lanterns and you stand in the circuit and you hold what you're holding, and the hollow can find the frequency, but it can't find that. It can't find the part where you do it anyway. Uchi was quiet for a moment, then he said, when I was young, very young, before all of the rest of it, my mother hung a lantern outside the house on this night, every year, without exception, even in the years when there was very little else. What did she say it was for? She said it was to make sure the dead could find their way back, if they wanted to come. He paused. I have been, in some sense, one of those dead. I have been dispersed and patternless and very far from any light that could find me, and I came back. Yeah, Daigo said. I came back because there was something to come back to, Uchi said. Not the light alone, the people behind the light. Daigo let that sit. The festival district breathed around them. All that warm amber light, all that paper and flame, all those small arguments against the dark made real by the fact that someone had bothered. Somewhere in the city, a generator hummed. Somewhere on the base, the night shift was taking over from the day shift, and the war was continuing with the steady relentlessness that wars maintained regardless of what was happening in any particular festival district. None of that had stopped. None of it was going to stop because of paper lanterns and 3 soldiers and an old man in an apron. But the lanterns were lit, and the circuit was clear. And the hollow had come for what the humans had built here, and had found that what humans built from grief was not the exploitable weakness they'd assumed it was, but something they could ride and could not own, could find and could not take, could use as a signal and could never finally understand. Daigo put his hand in his pocket and felt the pendant through the fabric. His father had told him, once a long time ago, the things that scare them most are the things they can't put a name to, and the things that can't be named are the things that are real. The rest is just mechanics. He hadn't fully understood it then. He was starting to... Now, Nasen, he said. Yeah, Nasen said. You said your niece carried a lantern the whole length of the main street. She did, Nasen said. Which lantern was it, do you know? Nasen thought about it. He pointed to one of the shops on the east side, a small stall with a yellow and red lantern currently lit, swaying in the warm evening air. One like that, he said. Same colors. She picked it out herself, very serious about it. They stood and looked at it for a while. The yellow and red lantern doing what lanterns did, being light, being color, being the visible proof that someone had taken a moment to make this specific small thing real. Then Nasen said, I have a terrible joke about a lantern and a hollow ghost, but it requires setup. Then set it up, Daigo said. So Nasen told the joke, and it was terrible. And they were standing in a festival district full of light that they had made themselves because the district needed it, and the war was still out there being a war. And the summer heat pressed down from its white sky, And the hollow had come and found the frequency, and ridden it all the way to this circuit, and discovered that the frequency belonged to the people who'd made it and always would. Uchi laughed at the joke, which surprised Nasen so much he almost dropped his communicator. Was it actually funny? Nasen said, astonished. No, Uchi said, composing himself, but you told it with such confidence. Nasen pointed at him. That is the highest praise I have ever received. The lantern swayed. The summer went on being summer. The circuit stayed lit. They walked home through it. All that light they'd made. All those small arguments they'd decided to make real. And above the festival district, the first stars of the evening were appearing, one by one, the way they always did, the way they'd been doing since before anything walking the earth beneath them had thought to name them, patient and indifferent and beautiful, carrying their light across distances that made every human grief and every human war and every human act of stubborn persistence look very small. Which was, Daigo thought, exactly the right perspective. You were small. You were temporary. The universe had not asked for your input. You lit the lanterns anyway. That was what his father had meant all those years ago in the early mornings before the expeditions, when the gear was packed and the sky was still the particular deep blue that belonged to the hour before light and the world had the quality of something waiting. He'd pressed the pendant into Daigo's hand and said, "Carry it. It'll remind you what you're made of." And Daigo had carried it through everything. Through the Kalthos Valley and the Eastern District campaign and the forward lines and the festival, circuit full of hollow ghosts riding the grief frequency of people who had loved their dead and wouldn't stop. And he'd thought, for a long time, that the pendant was a reminder of strength, of toughness, of the quality that kept you moving when moving was irrational. He understood now that it was a reminder of something different, not strength, tenderness, the willingness to carry something warm and old and specific through every cold place, not because it had tactical value, not because it gave you an edge, but because it was real and the things that were real were worth carrying. The hollow could not carry anything. That was the truth underneath all the tactics and the taxonomies and the energy signatures and the category ratings. They could absorb, they could possess, they could ride the frequencies that humans built. They could wear the faces of the grief and speak with the voices of the lost, but they could not carry something real because they had no real thing to carry. They were pattern without substance, coherence without content, the shape of sorrow without the sorrow, and humans were the opposite, even at their most dispersed. Even in their worst years, the worst campaigns, the worst losses, they kept picking things up. Amber pendants, bad jokes, indoor beaches in climate-controlled medical bays, paper lanterns lit on a summer evening in a restricted zone because the district needed them, and that was reason enough. They kept picking things up and carrying them and handing them on, generation to generation, the whole long, ridiculous, tender freight of human life moving forward, not because it was efficient, but because they couldn't seem to stop. The hollow had been exploiting that for centuries. They had ridden the frequencies and possessed the hosts and built Category 9 coherences out of accumulated human grief, and they had always misread the signal they'd seen: weakness, vulnerability, a wound that could be opened. They hadn't seen the reason the signal was so strong was that the thing it recorded had actually happened. The love had been real. The loss had been real. The tenderness had been real. The frequency was powerful because the events that generated it were genuine, and genuine events left marks that were not exploitable so much as they were indelible. They could be found but not owned, ridden but not directed, amplified but not controlled. You could find a human's grief frequency and ride it back to the living world. You could possess the body that carried the grief and use it against the other bodies it loved. You could build your most coherent form from the accumulated memorial pattern of a festival district. You couldn't make the grief mean what you wanted it to mean. You couldn't re-author the love that generated it. You couldn't become the thing you'd only ever consumed. And when the people who owned the frequency turned it back on you, when they stood in the circuit they'd built and remembered the real things instead of performing the grief at you, when they lit the lanterns not for tactical purposes, but because the lanterns needed lighting, when a man with a dead father's tooth in his hand pressed his hands against a wooden column and simply remembered, that was the discharge, that was the weapon, not the Garanodon cells, not the technical configuration, not the phase inversion math that Yayoi would spend 4 days writing up. The love, the real and specific and non-transferable love, that was the thing the hollow couldn't counter. because they'd never figured out how to have any. Daigo walked back through the festival district one last time as the stars came fully out. The lanterns were still lit. They'd burn for another few hours before the paper gave out or the fuel ran low, and the circuit was quiet and clean, and smelled of summer and old lacquer and something he couldn't name. Something that was the smell of places where people had been real at each other for a long time. He stopped at the bandstand column for a moment. The wood was warm from the discharge, warm from the summer, warm from whatever the Zyudenryu spirits had routed through it. He put one hand on it and felt the residual frequency, not the combat amplitude, just the deep settled hum of something old and patient that had been here for a very long time and was going to be here for a very long time after. He thought about dinosaurs, about the age before the Hollow, before the war, before the forward operating bases and the energy taxonomies, the deep old age when the Earth had belonged to creatures that were, by all accounts, very bad at being afraid. That was the thing the xenobiology team had found in the Zyudenchi frequency, the thing encoded in every battery cell they'd built from the Hollow's own resonance turned back on them, the signature of something that faced extinction with the particular quality of a being that had never, on a species level, developed a strategy for giving up. The dinosaurs had lost, in the end. The asteroid had won, or the climate had won, or the slow competitive pressure of smaller, faster things had won, depending on which account you read. But they'd been at it for 200 million years, which was considerably longer than humanity had managed so far, and the frequency they'd left behind in the rock and the fossil record and the amber-encased teeth of old pendants was the frequency of things that had lived with absolute commitment to the act of living. The Hollow had been trying to extinguish that frequency for longer than human civilization had existed. They hadn't managed it yet. Daigo took his hand off the column. He felt the pendant through his collar one more time. He went to find his team. They were where they usually were when the immediate tactical situation was resolved and the paperwork hadn't yet caught up to them, together, in the closest available space with sufficient light and something to eat. Nasen had found a stall on the eastern end of the circuit that hadn't been completely emptied by the evacuation and had produced, with the triumphant air of a man who considered field improvisation to extend naturally into the culinary domain, an assortment of food items that should not have survived 2 months of a restricted zone, but apparently had. There was something that had been rice and was now a form of rice that had opinions. There was a jar of something pickled. There was, inexplicably, a sealed bag of those small individually wrapped sweet mochi that came in 5 colors. Uchi was eating the mochi with the focused attention he brought to most things, apparently having decided that 5-color mochi was within the range of modern experiences worth adapting to. Nasen was telling a story. It was, from the fragments Daigo caught walking up, a story about his niece and a particularly determined beetle she had found in his garden, and it had nothing to do with the war, or the Hollow, or the festival district, or any of the things that had happened that day, and that was precisely why he was telling it. Daigo sat down. Someone handed him food. Above them, the stars were out in full now, the whole brilliant, ridiculous abundance of them, and the lanterns were still burning, and the circuit was clean, and somewhere in the city the old man in the lantern maker's shop was probably doing what he always did in the evenings, after a festival day, which was sit in the back room with whatever remained of the day and hold it quietly for a while before letting it go. And the beetle, Nasan was saying with complete commitment, was still there the next morning, on the exact same leaf, just sitting there, very pleased with itself. Was it the same beetle? Uchi said. I chose to believe it was, Nasan said, for narrative reasons. Daigo ate his food and watched his team and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. The war would resume in the morning. The instruments would find new readings in new grids, and the tactical cycles would turn, and the Hollow would come again in whatever form they chose. Next. That was the shape of things, and it wasn't going to change because of one summer night and one festival district. But tonight the lanterns were lit. Tonight the circuit was clean. Tonight 3 people who had every reason to be exhausted and frightened and closed off were sitting in the warm dark eating 5-color mochi and talking about a beetle, which was, Daigo thought, turning the pendant once in his fingers before tucking it away for the last time. The most specifically human thing he had witnessed all day. And he had witnessed some very human things today. He looked up at the stars. They looked back with a patient indifference of things that had been doing this for a very long time, and would go on doing it for a very long time. more regardless of what the small warm creatures on the small warm planet below them got up to in their brief, brilliant tenure. They had never asked for this, none of it. Not the war, not the hollow, not the pendant, not the festival circuit, and the paper lanterns and the grief frequency in the Category 9 collapsing like a knot coming undone, because a man had stood at a column and remembered his father. They'd done it anyway. That was, Daigo thought, probably enough.